Hey, welcome into Gun Talk Nation. Gun Talk Nation is brought to you by Pyramid Air, your number one resource for everything air gun, and by Savage Arms. So, we think of the U.S. as being the only place there's really a gun culture, and it's the gunny world for everything that we do, but that's not really true. I mean, there is gun culture all over the place, and to our neighbors to the north, up in Canada, that's definitely the case. And so there's a lot going on right now, so I thought we would talk with someone who knows the ins and outs of gun laws in Canada, the current events, because there's some interesting things happening right now of what the politicians are trying to pass up there and tweak the way that Canadians have their gun rights regulated and all that stuff. And so we thought we'd go right to the source. So today on the show, we're going to bring in Adam Patterson from the Korth Group. Adam, welcome in.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, thanks. So as I kind of introduce this, people go, wait a minute, why are we talking about Canadian gun laws and gun culture in Canada? Well, I mean, as you and I were starting the conversation, I said, well, wait a minute, let's talk about this actually on the show because it's too good to pass up. First off, explain the Korth Group, who you guys are, what you do, and maybe your background in guns.
Sure, absolutely. So Korth Group is a distributor in Canada. We have national coverage with a sales team spanning the country. We distribute a lot of the big names: Hornady, Leupold, Ruger, Kimber, Proof Research, Ely Ammunition, Dart and Archery, Raven Archery, a few accessory lines. So we're fairly well versed in most all aspects of the shooting sport. We've recently added shotgun lines from FabArm and Rite, as well as Rio Ammunition. So we're fairly well covered as far as what firearms we have access to and product that we can provide to the Canadian marketplace. And we've been in business since 1977, family-owned company, well regarded within the industry here in Canada, and great partnerships with U.S. manufacturers. Yeah, for myself, I've worked in the. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, I was just going to say. I mean, you guys cover the waterfront. I mean, whether it's shooting, target shooting, or hunting, or even archery, you guys do a little bit of everything.
We do it all, and we've got the reloading in there, and we pretty much have our hands in all the pots when it comes to firearms and archery use in Canada.
Yeah,
which is great. And then on a personal note, it makes it a very expensive place to work, to be quite honest. There's lots of cool things to pick up.
Yeah, what's your background
myself, I've worked in the firearms industry for about 13 years now, and I've worked retail, I've worked distribution, and dabble a little bit in a few different disciplines in the competitive side, and do a bit of hunting and try and keep myself well versed in what's going on in the marketplace. And I address our marketing matters here at Korth Group and work with our pro staff and our sales guys to do what we can for the market up here.
So, and I led in by saying there is gun culture all over the world for the most part. Certainly that's the case in Canada. How much of it is shooting versus hunting? Where it seems to be, where is the Canadian market these days?
It's fairly split. So we have a population of 37 and change million people. We do have firearms licensing here. So in order to legally own a firearm, you have to have a firearms license issued by our federal government. There's 2.1 million legal firearms owners in Canada. So as a population base goes, it's not quite 10% of our total population. But we do have a per capita rate of 241 gun owners per 1,000 people, with a fairly heavy concentration of firearms. We have about 7.2 million firearms in Canada based on the most recent numbers that have been provided to us through Stats Canada. So there's a fairly heavy usage group of shooters and hunters. Hunting is on the increase this last year or so as the COVID sort of reminded people that they might have to self-sustain. Right. And then the competitive market is quite popular here. We have national events that occur. PRS has Canadian specific matches they run. We have IPSC nationally. We have USPSA. And then three gun, we'll get into some of the laws. Three gun was a thing here, but it's not quite what it was due to our legislation changes last year.
I think it's important to talk about when we think about gun rights, And tell me if I'm correct on this, Adam. In the United States, we talk about the Second Amendment and our right to bear arms. That's not necessarily the case in Canada, correct?
Not at all. We do not have the right to bear arms. We do not have any sort of legally binding permission from anywhere to own firearms. It's a privilege here, something that we all take very seriously as gun owners, because there is no right to firearms in this country.
How does that change the dynamic in what you guys do and in dealing with the regulations?
Well, in a lot of cases, we're here to sort of accept, and in some cases, what the government wants to allow us to have access to. We're somewhat beholden to their decisions and their approach to the laws. We don't have that Second Amendment to cover us from any sort of wild ideas or quick changes that may or may not have any impact on the reality of gun crime and all the various issues that are pegged on firearms.
Yeah, we saw that in New Zealand, I guess about 2 years ago when they had that horrible tragedy down there. And within days, the gun laws were changed dramatically. And I know a lot of people here go, wait a minute, how could they do that? Well, there's not a Second Amendment there. They don't actually have the right to bear arms. So same thing in Canada. Do you guys have gun rights groups or that are kind of legislating for you?
Yes, we have 3 civilian groups that are finally starting to work together to be a bit more united. They're the Canadian Coalition for Firearms Rights, CCFR for short, the Canadian Shooting Sports Association, and the National Firearms Association. And then on the corporate side, there's the Canadian Sporting Arms and Ammunition Association, which I'll refer to as the CSAAA. And that is a group made up of firearms industry members from dealers, distributors, rep groups, and manufacturers that do work very closely with the federal government to lobby on behalf of the firearms industry. And part of their mandate, because we do not have a Second Amendment concept of firearm rights, the pitch from the CSAAA is to ensure that there is a future for the 25,000 Canadians that work in the firearms industry, and to approach any potential changes in firearms law as to the impact it's going to have on the industry as a whole, rather than the individual user. Now, obviously, the individual user is important, but we have a whole industry and series of jobs and distribution networks to protect.
More of a commerce play as far as the argument goes.
Yeah, and in some cases that can have some success, but ultimately we're limited to what the government is willing to do as far as working with us and what they need to do to appease their voting public.
And somebody might be listening and they go, why are we talking about this? Well, gun laws they don't live in a bubble, and gun regulations don't live in a bubble. And we see that here in the States, the more restrictive states like California or New York, a lot of those ideas that come out of there are introduced in other states when they go, that's an interesting idea. Let's try to restrict it this way or that way. And it's the same thing. We see that internationally, especially in our world today. We are connected so much easier with the internet and social media and everything else, and heck, podcasts, where ideas can be floated out there. And so I think it's important for us in the United States to be familiar with what is being done and in other places. So give people a picture of Canadian gun laws as they exist right now. And I don't expect you to be an expert on how it works in the United States, but how it may differ a little bit. And then let's talk about kind of what's happening in the last several weeks.
For sure. And I think something that is worth noting, and we were kind of touching this prior to going live on the call here, is that we share a border, and we long history between our two countries of trade partners and working together. And at what point is Canada used as an example for further gun restrictions in the U.S. because we are right next door and at times seen as the 51st state, depending on whose prerogative it is. And is that possibly going to cause negative implications for U.S. gun owners when Canada is used as an example and New Zealand's used as an example and all the other first world nations are used as an example to try and change your laws.
Yeah, anytime.
But nevertheless, onto your question. Oh.
Yeah, anytime gun regulation is floated as a good idea, that's just something that can kind of infiltrate all sorts of areas. So it's a good point.
For sure. And then regarding the Canadian program, I can give you kind of a rough overview of how it works and then get into it a little further. So in order to acquire a firearm in this country, you have to be 18 years old. You have to take a course where you have a 2-day class to learn what we call non-restricted firearms. So we have 3 classifications of firearms: non-restricted, which would be your typical hunting rifles and shotguns; restricted, which are handguns. They were ARs and anything that falls under certain barrel length or overall length rules; and then prohibited. And there's different types of prohibited, so we can get into that. So once you're 18, you can go and take the non-restricted course, which is an in-class session with a written and practical exam at the end. It is a federally mandated program, although it's taught by regional instructors that are not government employees, but they are hired to be the trainers for this program. Upon successful completion of the non-restricted course, you're permitted to take the restricted course, which focuses mostly on handguns at this point. From there, you send that package of information with your signed off paperwork from the instructor to our federal government, where they conduct a series of background checks. They will reach out to your spouse or any ex-partners that you've had within the last 5 years. They do a very comprehensive background check. And from that point, your license will be issued, and you usually receive it in about 60 days, give or take. Sometimes a bit faster. The last year or so, it's been a little bit slower. So from there, once you have that firearms license, you're able to go into a gun shop and buy a firearm. Non-restricted firearms, you're able to take home with you at the point of purchase. Non-restricted firearms, restricted firearms. So if you go in to buy a handgun, you have to wait for that transfer of the ownership of that handgun from the gun shop to you as an individual to be approved by provincially run chief firearms offices. So our firearms law is a federal program, and then each province is handled by its own chief firearms office. So some provinces are very quick. We're headquartered in Alberta, which is directly north of Montana, for those that are not familiar. Right. We generally have our approvals processed in 2 to 3 days, whereas Ontario, which is directly north of Buffalo and Michigan, they can take up to 6 weeks to have their approvals processed. And then from there, in order to legally own a handgun in this country, 90% of the time you have to belong to a gun club, and you're allowed to take that handgun from your home to the gun club and then back to your home again. We have no concealed carry. We have no usage of these firearms outside of target purposes at an approved gun range.
So yeah, just to piggyback on that, you are only allowed to have it at your home or at that designated gun club. You can't go anywhere else with it. Is that right?
Correct. The law is written that you have to take the most reasonable route to the gun club and then back to your home. Wow.
So let's talk about AR-15s, because in the past, my understanding was they weren't exactly illegal, but they were highly regulated. But it sounds like maybe that's changed.
Yeah. So up until last year, May 1st of last year, ARs were considered restricted firearms in semi-auto only configuration. Fully automatics have been prohibited in Canada since the late 70s. The people that owned them at that time were able to keep them, but they've no longer been allowed to shoot them since, I believe, the mid to late 90s. And there's probably people listening that are going to be able to correct me on that. So take this all with a grain of salt, because those dates I'm fuzzy on, but the prohibition of full autos was in the late 70s, and they were allowed to keep using them at approved ranges until mid to late 90s, and then that ceased.
And so you're saying that you're allowed to own full auto, but you actually are not allowed to even shoot it.
Correct, but you had to own one the day the law came into effect in 77 or 78 to be allowed to keep it. If you did not have one at that time, you're not ever allowed to have one.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So fairly restrictive, but back to the ARs. So up until last year, AR-15s were classed as restricted firearms. We have no barrel length issues. They are range only. You cannot hunt with them. You cannot have them as a truck gun. They're the same rule and same classification as a handgun. We are limited to 5-round magazines, although there's a caveat in our law for pistol mags that people could have a 10-round mag in their AR. And that was it. They were range only, and you were not permitted to do anything with them outside of taking to and from the range.
And now that's changed.
Correct. We had a mass shooting occur in the Maritimes in Nova Scotia the end of April last year. And unfortunately, several people were killed. The gentleman that committed this crime had illegally sourced firearms, one of which was an AR. And our federal government waited 3 days, I believe, after this happened to force a ban through Parliament on the AR-15 and the Mini-14 and a whole variety of other firearms.
So these are not
similar to the knee-jerk reaction. Oh.
Sure. So, and he used an AR-15. Is that correct?
That's what they're saying. An AR and a Mini-14 and a couple of handguns that had all been illegally sourced.
Okay. Yeah. Go figure. The murderer didn't follow the gun laws.
Exactly. And from what we hear, they were sourced in the U.S. and smuggled across the border illegally. And he was prohibited from owning firearms because of a criminal record. And the feds used this as an opportunity to take ARs away from the legal licensed owners in Canada.
Wow. So now the situation, so the ARs were similar to handguns. They were regulated, restricted. And now what is the situation for AR-15s today? Hey, Gun Talk Nation is brought to you by ATN, the future of optics. ATN offers Smart HD, Ultra HD, thermal and night vision rifle scopes, binoculars, rangefinders, and more. With features like Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, extended battery life, Ultra HD sensor resolution, and full HD video recording, cutting-edge technology meets quality parts in every ATN product. The future of optics is already here. Find your next optic at atncorp.com. And by Walther Arms. The Performance Duty Pistol is Walther's latest defensive handgun. Optics ready, optimized for red dots, with it's called super terrain serrations, and grip texture, plus a step chamber for pushing higher velocities. The PDP is available in full-size and compact versions in 3 different slide lengths. It's your duty to be ready. Find out more at waltherarms.com. What is the situation for AR-15s today?
So we're currently in a state of holding. We are not allowed to take our ARs out of our house. We're not allowed to sell them, including the upper receiver. In the past, the firearm, as per our firearms laws, is the serialized part, which generally is the lower receiver on most firearms. The feds have also prohibited the upper receiver in an effort to stop people from being able to complete the assembly of any strip lowers they bought during the last scare of potential bans over the last few years. There's been a fairly large uptick in sales for strip lowers, and the upper receivers have also been prohibited so that those guns cannot be completed and built into full functioning firearms. So we are not allowed to do anything with our ARs unless we want to turn them in for destruction, or we somehow have a way to export them outside of Canada, which is incredibly complicated. The only market realistically that could take them is the U.S., and your government's quite strict on what they allow to be imported.
Right. What was the response by Canadian gun owners when this happened? I mean, I understand there's not a Second Amendment, but I mean, what was the response with this when this went into place?
Well, as you would expect, everybody that owns an AR is fairly outraged. We've had law enforcement stand up and stand behind us, saying that we're not the problem. These ARs are not a problem. There's only a couple of instances in Canadian history where an AR was even involved in any sort of crime. And most of the 2 that I'm aware of, one for sure was illegally imported from the U.S. So it's not an issue. The AR is not an issue for gun violence in Canada. So we've had a lot of people quite upset about this. Unfortunately, it's falling on deaf ears for the most part by our federal government. because it isn't about the realities. It's about perceptions and about what their voting populace is going to like.
Right. And probably driven a lot by the bigger cities who have maybe the gun ownership is lower there, that type of thing, similar to in the U.S., I imagine.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, our media is inundated with U.S. news. As you would expect, sharing a border, we hear a lot about what goes on the U.S. side. And all of the examples of terrible incidences with ARs are U.S.-based. And the New Zealand example, we've never had that happen, fortunately, in Canada. And that information is used to sort of misinform the public that are ignorant. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They're just not firearms owners. They're not firearms users. They may be indifferent to firearms because generally we don't have a lot of gun crime in Canada. But those big incidences that happen stateside are used to help convince people that we shouldn't be allowed to have those kind of guns here.
So bring us up to speed now with what's been going on lately in the news for you guys with gun laws.
Well, there's talk of a potential federal election this year. Our government's hoping to ride the wave of popularity from paying people over COVID to stay home. We had a fairly lucrative benefit package where most people were paid about $2,000 a month to not work during COVID. So it's for those that chose not to work. It was a pretty good deal to have summer off last year, spend it at the beach while getting paid. So, which is a little bit off topic of what we're talking about here, but it ties into the pitch of what our government's trying to do moving forward. So they've proposed a new bill that will bring a great deal of headache to our industry and even further complications to the usage and sale and ownership of firearms. So the proposed changes will introduce red flag laws. Now, we sort of have this already because of our licensing system. And as I mentioned, your spouse and any ex-partners within the last 5 years have to sign off on your mental fitness and your capacity to own firearms. So we have a pretty good system in place where people that shouldn't have access to guns generally don't because they're vetted out through our licensing program.
Or just anyone
they're adding in
or just anyone who's been a jerk with their former boyfriends or girlfriends also don't own guns, apparently.
Correct. Yes, your ex, one way or the other, can have a say whether or not you get to have a firearms license, and you may not be allowed to have a firearms license.
You just happen to be
time period has passed.
Infidelity. And all of a sudden you have no guns because
And if people are upset, and yes, bad things can happen for sure.
Jeez.
Now, the other side of that, obviously, there's lots of jokes to be had, but the system is actually fairly efficient at vetting those that shouldn't have access to it. Because obviously there are people that have mental health issues,
right.
And our system works fairly well to vet those people out, which is good because the less illegal activity we have with firearms, the better it is for everybody. So what they're looking at introducing, though, is a proper red flag law similar to what I believe has been enacted in a few states, where anybody can call the police at any time and raise concerns over the fitness of the firearms owner, and the police will come and collect your firearms without a warrant, and then you'll have to jump through a whole bunch of hoops to try and get them back. Yeah, which is quite concerning.
And then they took the step of saying we're going to let each province or each municipality make their own gun laws, and that's something unique because we have that here to some degree, but my understanding is Canada is all the gun laws are basically federal across the board, same thing everywhere, but that's changing.
Correct, and so the complication with that is proposed to change. So the bill. And our system of government's a little bit different than yours. So the bill's at the first reading. So there's still quite a process to be worked through. There has to be a second reading. And then once that second reading's approved, there's a third reading. And then that third reading approval will go up to our Senate, and they have to go through the whole process all over again through 3 readings. And our federal government is only active until the third week of June, and then they shut down for the summer break. And essentially that wipes the slate clean. They would have to readdress this again in the fall. So it's possible it won't happen, but there is the potential that it could be pushed through and forced upon us. So the concept is that the federal government runs the program. It's administered by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is a national firearms organization here that it has frontline policing in some provinces and some jurisdictions, but is the overseer for the firearms program in Canada. And the concept is that the municipalities individually would be permitted to create a gun ban within their municipality. But in order to do so, the province would have to approve it because we have a hierarchy of government. The federal government will say you can do this. The individual province would have to approve it for their municipalities to participate in this program. And then the municipality itself would have to enact a gun ban. What that's going to look like and how that's actually going to work is yet to be determined. You might be surprised to hear that the federal government hasn't really thought all this through. And
yeah, I'm glad we have some things
sort
in
of
common.
Shooting from the hip, so to speak.
Yeah, we're not really worried about how this is going to actually take place. This is just, let's come up with some make-believe things. What if?
They'll figure it out later, right? So that's kind of the proposal that will happen. Now, in addition to this, in the bill C-21 is the name of this bill. It's an extenuation in some cases to the Order in Council, which was the proposition to ban ARs and a variety of other firearms at that time. So at May 1st of last year, the government forced through an Order in Council, which they were able to basically pass this law without any opposition, any discussion on the floor. They just made it happen. And they banned ARs and a whole variety of firearms tied into ARs. And you'll see in the news 1,500 firearms have been banned. And that's not entirely true. It's actually 1,500 models of firearms have been banned, which has included pretty much every AR-15, any AR that's based on a 9mm platform, any AR derivative firearm. They've even gone so far as to banning shotguns that have a detachable magazine that look kind of like an AR, most of which originate from Turkey. We're hugely popular in 3-gun competition up here. Anything that could be deemed AR-esque is now prohibited. So as of May 1st, the initial ban went through. And since May 1st, the government has been backdating certain models as they see fit without informing anybody.
Wow.
So we do have a national registry of firearms called the Firearms Reference Table. I shouldn't say registry, sorry, it's classification. So the Firearms Reference Table has a specific number tied to every firearm model and then sort of submodel and caliber under that family of models. And the government's been going in and adding additional models and sub-configurations of models to the ban list without informing anybody.
Oh, that's
and
nice.
Part of their buyback. Yeah, and it's really unfortunate for the people that have purchased a gun in good faith and then find out possibly that they bought it illegally because it had been made prohibited, backdated to before they actually purchased the firearm.
So it's like an Easter egg hunt for you guys in the firearms industry to go, let's check in this week and see what's new on the list of things that aren't allowed.
Exactly. And what can happen and has happened to some of our distributor peers in Canada is that they've discovered this as they're trying to have a shipment of firearms processed by customs at the border.
Oh, wow.
Only to find out that they're now that model or models in the shipment are prohibited and the entire shipment is seized by Canada Border Services. And then they have to go through a pile of legal loopholes to try and get the non-prohibited items processed through. And it just becomes a paperwork and processing fee nightmare for everybody involved.
Wow. So Adam, we're listening to this and it's probably pretty incredible to our listeners. And what you really are laying out here is the loss of gun rights progressively as we've gone through the years. And it kind of seems like there's not a whole lot to stop it. I mean, what would be your message for our listeners as they listen to this and hear how this has taken place?
Oh, that's a tough one because I think the get out of jail card for the American gun owning populace is that Second Amendment. We have no constitutional right to firearms, as we discussed earlier. Mm-hmm. Really, I can say from our side, the one saving grace for us is our Aboriginal community. That the group of people in that category are such huge hunters and huge outdoors people. I think they're going to be what helps keep us from losing everything ultimately, because the hunting and sustenance hunting, living off the land is such a huge part of their lifestyle. So that might be the only thing that will help keep us into some form of ownership outside of petitioning government and a governmental change, which, similar to your federal government, when you have a friendly government, you don't have to worry about anything being taken away. But for you guys, it's a tough one. I think what happens to us will probably be used as an example of what could happen in the U.S. And I think you need to be very concerned about that. And I think any concession to give the government anything should be avoided at all costs.
Yes, because and what I hear is the loss of rights. There's no like compromise. There's no give and take. It's just progressively losing those privileges. In your case, privileges. In our case, rights. Adam, thanks for filling us in on this. This is very eye-opening, I think, for everybody listening.
Well, I'm glad that we can help, and hopefully it brought a little bit more light to the realities of what can happen with an unfriendly government. Absolutely.
Adam Patterson, Korth Group, thanks for being with us. That's it for us. We'll see you next time on Gun Talk Nation.